Blase produces, above all, Art Zone. Gravediggers.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, good afternoon, folks. At least from where I'm sitting, it's good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are.
And welcome to another episode of Das Criminal Podcast.
Yeah, and we have another juicy episode for you. It's one where I have very conflicting feelings. There's very little sympathetic characters, or at least like from the living side. And I just wanted to say that it's going to be an interesting one.
We do want to give a quick content warning. We will discuss sexual assault later in this episode, and we also mention suicidal ideation. So if those are things that really distress you to hear about, this might not be the best episode for you.
Yeah, so just a heads up on that. So without further ado, we can jump into it. In the early hours of December 28th, 2015, Lynn Witteveen was woken up in her Haggis Drive, Peterborough home by a commotion in the kitchen. She made her way to the source of the noise just in time to see her partner, Dr. Andrew Chan, plead with his son Thomas as Thomas stabbed him to death. Thomas then turns attention to Lynn. He stabs her multiple times, but she manages to flee to the bedroom and call 911. The operator hears Lynn plead with her partner's son, "I love you, I love you." Inaudible screaming follows, and then, I'm dead. Lynn tells the dispatcher she has a knife in her head. In the background, Thomas is heard yelling. Lynn Witteveen survived this horrific attack. Unfortunately, her partner and Thomas's father, Andrew, did not. So, what happened? To get into the crime itself, Thomas Chan, the perpetrator, was at the time of the crime, December 28, 2015, a 19-year-old first-year policing student in Peterborough, Ontario, which is a city northeast of Toronto. He graduated from Lakeview College School, which is a high school, and played rugby regularly while in school. But because of rugby, he got a string of concussions playing rugby. That led to negative academic performances, which sort of forced him to curtail his sporting activities.
We'll circle back to the head injuries, but I just want to note, I think it's interesting that the police in places like the USA and Canada don't typically recruit the brightest students. They actually specifically hire people with lower academic performances. In the year 2000, a man named Robert Jordan in Connecticut lost a lawsuit against a local police department after they didn't hire him because he scored too high on an IQ test. I'd argue that as a group that uses violence to enforce order, the police don't want people they might consider too smart to work as grunts.
Yeah, you're right. I think, they don't want people to question orders. That's a big thing, If you get an order that might conflict with your moral compass, you might question it, and that's not a no-go for an institution that depends on obedience to your superiors.
Right.
So Thomas at this time was dividing his time between his divorced parents. On the one hand, his father, Dr. Andrew Chan, was a local gastroenterologist and was living with his partner, Lynn Witteveen. On the other hand, his mother, Rosalia Roz Vastano, was living with her partner, Jeff Phillips, and Andrew and Rosalia's daughter and Thomas's older sister, Christina Chan. On December 27, 2015, Thomas was enjoying some beers with high school friends at a local bar, and during the course of the evening, they decide to buy some magic mushrooms and go to Thomas's mother's house. So, magic mushrooms, for those who don't know, are mushrooms that contain a chemical called psilocybin. And that's a chemical that causes audiovisual hallucinations and altered emotional states very similar to LSD.
In most cases, mushrooms are considered medically safe and non-addictive. Someone could get hurt if they were tripping and ran in front of a car, but the injury itself would be caused by the impact from the vehicle and not from the drug itself, in contrast with, say, overdosing on heroin.
Yeah, exactly. And not only are mushrooms considered medically safe, there's a lot of research being done now into their possible therapeutic effects for various neuroscientific and neurological disorders.
That's exciting.
Yeah. But at this point, mushrooms, I believe, are illegal in terms of possession and distribution and such and such. Thomas and three friends took a handful each, and the friends began feeling the effects as predicted, but Thomas remained sober. Just a FYI, it takes about 30 minutes to an hour after ingestion for effects to begin, and Thomas and company all have done shrooms before. And at this point, I think Thomas figured his large physique meant that he needed another handful because he was larger and therefore might need a stronger dose.
I think it's crucial to point out that Thomas had done mushrooms before, and though we can't say with those trips we definitely know he didn't kill anyone. At first I kind of thought, well, he probably didn't have a bad trip before because if he had, then why would he take mushrooms again? But actually I've had some pretty nasty hangovers in the past, and guess what? I still drink sometimes knowing these risks.
Yeah, I think we can't say for sure if he's ever had a bad trip before, but it does seem like they knew what they were doing. This wasn't the first rodeo for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Early on December 28th, in the early morning, in the AM, Thomas begins having a bad trip, ranting and raving. He runs up to his mom's bedroom and yells at them, basically calling them devils and Satan.
I wonder why so many people who have hallucinations, be they from drugs or illness or what have you, have religious delusions. I suppose it depends on what we're predisposed to. Someone raised with religion might have thoughts connected to that, whereas someone who used to live in a war zone might have visions that harken back to that time in their life. Maybe?
Maybe. I feel like even people who aren't raised in a religious household per se might have not necessarily strict religious hallucinations, but maybe something resembling demons and so on, just because we as a society, I guess, predispose people to think of demons and devils and what have you as things that might be hallucinated, like via, media and so on. Like whenever you watch movies or TV shows, even if you're not religious yourself, in those movies, the person who hallucinates will often hallucinate of demons or whatnot, no?
Yeah, but there's also the reverse where the religions that we follow could genuinely be based on people in the past having hallucinations.
Yeah, oh yeah. It's a very much a chicken and egg scenario, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Thomas, at this point, after yelling at his mom and waking her up and her boyfriend, flees the house shirtless and shoeless to his dad's house, which is like a short distance away down the block, while Roz, Jeff, and Chan's friend, Soren Christiansen, chase Thomas down the street. They chase him in Jeff's car, which leads to Thomas turning around and breaking Jeff's car window. And because none of them have a cell phone in the car because they basically just rushed outside, the trio drive away back to Roz's house to at least get a cell phone and to come back.
Is it known at this point if Thomas has a weapon? Because if he broke Jeff's car window with his bare hands, that's incredible.
Oh, it was with his bare hands. He had no weapon. He got his weapon in the house of his dad.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to say it's common, but there's definitely been cases where drugs, whether it's shrooms or acid or even things like cocaine, what have you, dull your pain perception. So you can do something like break the glass of a window without really feeling it.
Not just a window, but a car window.
Yeah. So Roz and Christina return this time. They return, I believe, in Roz's car, and Roz begins banging on the door to warn her ex-husband and Lynn that Thomas is not in his right mind, while Christina, his sister, is in the car calling the cops. While this is all happening in the Chan household, Thomas stabs his father, as we mentioned earlier, as Dr. Andrew Chan pleads, "It's daddy, it's daddy." Lynn is witnessing this. She flees to the master bedroom, and Thomas chases her down and stabs her too, multiple times. But she manages to reach the bedroom and call 911, and Thomas is following her and continuing to stab her while calling her Satan and devil, declaring that he needs to purge the house of evil.
As Amr noted at the top of the episode, Thomas killed his father, Andrew, but Andrew's partner, Lynn, miraculously survived, even though Thomas stabbed her in the head. But she has had lifelong medical complications from the attack, including losing her right eye, and she can no longer work. Survived is not the same as fully recovered.
Oh, yeah. She spent a long time with some paralysis. She needed tubes to eat. It's not pleasant. It wasn't like, oh, it's just a bruise or a cut. It was very bad. Like, she required multiple surgeries. And like you said, she still can't work because of it.
Mm-hmm.
The police arrive to a bloody scene. As the police arrive, Thomas yells, quote, "I am God. I finished my plan. Put a bullet in my head." End quote. He says to the arresting officers who basically tackle him. Also to note, officers claimed that Thomas had superhuman strength and was resisting arrest at the time.
This, in combination with the car window thing, is very frightening. If other people hadn't consumed the mushrooms from the same bag without issues, I would have wondered whether they were laced with something like PCP. But I suppose that's unlikely since only Thomas seemed to have this kind of trip.
I mean, it is possible that it might have trace amounts of PCP, but because Thomas took an extra dose compared to the rest, the effects hit him harder, maybe. And also, keep in mind that he was a rugby player, so his physique may have been larger than others. So I guess his strength is more.
Possibly, yeah.
At 3:55 a.m. on December 28th, Thomas Chan finds himself in the back of a police cruiser. Officer Brandon Edwards reads him his rights, informing him of his arrest on suspicion of murdering his father and attempted murder of Lynn. Chan was calm at this point and was causing no problems. When he arrived at the police station, he began sobering up as he was placed in the police station holding jail. But once he realized what happened, he began sobbing and presenting with suicidal ideation, causing the cops to place him under suicide watch.
Yeah, I mean, if I killed one of my family members while high on drugs, I wouldn't want to live anymore, honestly.
Yeah, it's just the realization when that hits you, I can't imagine what that's like.
Yeah.
So, fast forward to the trial. On March 2019, Chan was convicted of aggravated assault, manslaughter, and sentenced to a mandatory minimum of 5 years in prison.
I wonder what caused the prosecution to charge Thomas Chan with aggravated assault and manslaughter rather than murder. I would guess the difference is in premeditation. Typically, in a murder case, the prosecution has to show that the attacker planned to kill someone. Not necessarily that they left their house that day with murder on their mind, but that they had the opportunity to stop or turn back and decided to go through with the killing anyway. In Thomas Chan's case, he got his weapon, the butcher knife, from inside the house, and can even be heard on a security video during the killing saying, quote, "I love you all so much, I don't want to do this," end quote. So I think it would be difficult to prove that he planned to kill his father, even though his actions caused his father's death.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think from the prosecution's perspective, it was a strategic choice to opt for manslaughter and aggravated assault. Because, yeah, the standard of prosecution would have been much higher to prove murder because they'd have to prove that he had not necessarily the intentions, but that he could have stopped. And, at least with aggravated assault and manslaughter, it would have been a more sure conviction.
Right, you don't have to prove the premeditation factor.
Exactly. So Chan's team, his legal team of Danielle Robitaille and Matthew Gourlay of Heinen Hutchinson LLP, lodged an appeal claiming that Section 33.1 of the Canadian Criminal Code is unconstitutional. On June 2020, the Ontario Court of Appeals, which is the court above the regular court, grants Chan a new trial, ruling that Section 33.1 unconstitutionally deprived Chan of access to the non-mental disorder autism defense. We're going to get into this in a second, but basically they appeal. The Ontario Court of Appeals doesn't say that he's innocent or exonerate him, just that the trial had errors and that they have to restart the trial, do a new trial. The Crown, which is the prosecution in Canada for criminal cases, is called the Crown because, technically we're still under the head of state being the British monarchy. So the Crown appeals this decision, and the appeal goes all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada, which grants counsel the rights to appeal and affirms that they will schedule an appeal in the Supreme Court to hear this case. So, what is Section 33.1 and why is this important? Section 33.1 of the Canadian Criminal Code states, when a defense is not available, 33.1, it is not a defense to an offense referred to in subsection 3 that the accused, by reason of self-induced intoxication, lack the general intent or the voluntariness required to commit the offense, where the accused departed markedly from the standard of care as described in subsection 2. Subsection 2 in this case being criminal fault by reason of intoxication. For the purpose of this section, a person departs markedly from the standard of reasonable care generally recognized in Canadian society and is thereby criminally at fault where the person, while in a state of self-induced intoxication that renders the person unaware of or incapable of consciously controlling their behavior, voluntarily or involuntarily, interferes or threatens to interfere with the bodily integrity of another person. And the application, which is subsection 3 here, this section applies in respect of an offence under this act or any other act of Parliament that includes as an element an assault or any other interference or threat of interference by a person with the bodily integrity of another person.
So let's break down this legalese to explain what Section 33.1 actually means. Someone who harms another person after consuming an intoxicating substance on their own accord cannot argue that they are not criminally responsible because of the intoxication caused by said substance. For example, a person who willingly consumes alcohol and becomes intoxicated and then drives a car and hits someone else cannot use a legal defense saying that they are not responsible for the injuries or deaths caused by that collision because they were drunk. That person chose to drink alcohol, so they are responsible for their actions afterward. In most jurisdictions, a drunk person who hits and kills someone else is charged with manslaughter. If someone did not willingly take the drug, such as someone unknowingly given a drink with alcohol despite ordering one without alcohol, or being slipped some kind of other drug, then Section 33.1 would not apply, since it specifically notes, quote, self-induced intoxication, end quote. However, I can't find a specific case with those circumstances. As an aside, the legal philosophy behind DUI charges themselves is rather interesting. In cases where someone is caught driving while intoxicated, even when nobody is hurt, that person can be criminally charged despite no harm done. The argument is that laws don't only exist to punish people for harm caused, but to discourage harmful behavior in the first place. In the same vein, it's illegal to shoot a gun toward other people even if you don't hit them, because that's dangerous behavior. It's a demonstration of how we use the law to punish actions that could cause harm even when they don't in that particular circumstance. We as a society have largely accepted that the law can be used to discourage potentially harmful behavior, even when the possible dangerous outcome, like killing someone while drinking and driving, hasn't been realized in this particular circumstance. Just some legal philosophy for our listeners to ponder.
Yeah, I think this episode in this case does bring up a lot of really interesting legal philosophy questions that, we can question, you can analyze and so on. I do find it fascinating that for things like attempted murder, like if you attempt to murder someone and fail, from what I've read, sentencing is often not as extreme as actual murder, which I think is funny because, just because you didn't succeed in murdering someone, you shouldn't not have the same sentence apply.
Yeah, but I suppose then we also have to ask questions about when does things like planning an act of terrorism become an act of terrorism in and of itself? Should it be illegal to discuss with your friends the possibility of carrying out this attack? Could you be arrested for that even if you later turn around and say, well, I was never going to go through with that. I was just talking about it.
Yeah, I think it raises a lot of interesting questions. You're right. I think if we talk about things like attempts, versus the argument would be, is talking about it considered part of an attempt, is discussing it with yourself or whatnot, considered part of an attempt that can be tried as an attempt. It's all very murky. And I think it's a very difficult line to walk between, civil and human rights and things like society and law and protection of society at large.
Mm-hmm.
So the origins of 33.1 are actually really interesting in and of themselves. In 1989, in a suburb of Montreal, a 72-year-old alcoholic by the name of Henry Daviau drank several beers and a bottle of brandy before proceeding to rape a wheelchair-bound elderly woman.
First, what a sicko. Second, if this guy is an alcoholic, then I don't believe for a second that he was impaired by drinking to the point where he would act out of character. If anything, I think consuming alcohol would make him more into the person he really is, a disgusting rapist. There is some truth in the phrase liquid courage, and I don't think this is the only violent person who depends on drugs or alcohol to act out their sick urges on other people. One example is Ted Bundy, who used to get super drunk before he would rape and murder women.
Yeah, I really don't think that's a reasonable defense whatsoever. Also, if you're an alcoholic, like a genuine alcoholic, wouldn't your tolerance be much higher and therefore the amount you drank would make you drunk, but not blackout? And even if you were a blackout, again, I don't think that's impaired in any way, shape, or form.
Yes, and also people who are alcoholics and that they are physically dependent on alcohol need alcohol to function.
Yeah, exactly. So the defense itself is really important. And, we can get into it right now because Henry pleaded not guilty, but he was convicted in his trial. Of course, he appeals, and the appeal goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in 1994, the Supreme Court of Canada rules in a split decision that Davio couldn't be held criminally responsible for his actions because he was inebriated to the point of automatism, thus exonerating him, which is a decision that caused major controversy in Canada and internationally.
And it should cause controversy because drugs and alcohol are present in lots of rape cases, but they don't excuse causing harm.
Yeah, exactly. Like, first of all, if you're an alcoholic, you've been drinking a lot, so I don't think that changes your character so much as encourages it. And secondly, again, you voluntarily consuming a substance that intoxicates you is no excuse for applying or committing harm on other people.
Exactly.
So in 1994, while this is all happening, the federal government of Canada is under the control of the Liberal Party, headed by Jean Chrétien, whose Justice Minister, Alan Rock, he introduces a reform that would prevent extreme intoxication as a defense in criminal cases involving violent assault. This, of course, stemming from all the controversy and the public backlash, both in terms of mass demonstrations and opposition political parties using this as a cudgel against Chrétien. So he instructs Justice Minister Rock, to close this loophole, so to speak. And so the reform is introduced to prevent this extreme intoxication defense. And Rock manages to pass a bill that avoids the notwithstanding clause, which is, for non-Canadians, a very politically volatile issue where any bill that is passed in Parliament that creates a law that would otherwise violate the Canadian Charters of Rights and Freedom. So if a law is passed in Parliament that overrides or supersedes the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it must include the clause to make it legally sound, like the XYZ bill, notwithstanding the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But Rock avoided inserting the notwithstanding clause by maneuvering such that the law was introduced as a statutory amendment to overrule the courts for a period of 5 years before the courts of Canada can review this amendment. So he doesn't have to use a notwithstanding clause because technically he didn't introduce a new law, it was just an amendment.
Okay, so basically this bill has a built-in caveat so that people in the future could challenge its constitutionality. And the Thomas Chan case is that challenge in action. So that's interesting.
Exactly. That's how Rock managed to get on board people who are against his bill by virtue of constitutionality and legally sound and versus unsound health of the bill. He managed to get them on board by saying, okay, it's going to be an amendment. We'll have 5 years, and then if it's unconstitutional, then the courts can overrule it. But you're right. What's interesting is that even though in 1994 this passed, or in 1995 the section was added, it took all the way up until 2013-14 for all of this to come to a head, and not no one challenged this bill in 2000 or 2001 or 2002, which I find really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Which gets us back to 2013. Why did I say 2013 and not 2016 when Thomas Chan appealed 33.1? And that's because of another case that I'm going to sort of run through just as a comparison. The case of David Sullivan, who stabs his mother after overdosing on antidepressants. Sullivan, at this point, was unemployed. He lived at home with his mother. He had a history of crack and opioid addictions, and a history of childhood abuse, chronic depression, and a criminal history. He deliberately overdoses on an antidepressant called Wellbutrin, which I also am on. It's a secondary antidepressant that sort of soothes the side effects of primary SSRIs. He deliberately ODs in a suicide attempt, but I guess he didn't take enough to kill himself. He just took enough to cause a psychotic break in which he barges into his mom's room and begs his mother to help him avoid pursuing aliens before eventually turning on her and stabbing her with the kitchen knife. The mom survives the stabbing but dies of a heart attack before her son goes on trial, a heart attack that's completely unrelated to this case. The trial, which happens in 2016, gets David Sullivan convicted of aggravated assault and assault with a deadly weapon and sentenced to 5 years in prison before being released. However, in 2020, even though Sullivan at this point has served his sentence and has been released, decides to appeal to clear his criminal record. Lawyers Stephanie De Giuseppe and Anna Maria Ananager take his case, I guess, out of their legal perspective on constitutionality, and they take his case and launch an appeal to the Supreme Court also to challenge 33.1. At this point, because it's both happening in 2020, Thomas Chan's team and Sullivan's team meet up and they decide to organize a joint appeal, which is now, this whole situation is called the Sullivan-Chan appeal. I wanted to bring this up just because I think this is a very interesting game of strategy or tactics or politics, where the character of a person, of a defendant, is seen as important to the case as the facts of the case itself.
I think there is a fair comparison here in how sometimes to try and change the law or enact some kind of social change, people will pick and choose cases that they think have the best optics. I have read newspaper articles about how Thomas Chan is young and handsome and how horrible that this happened. And I mean, I don't think he's not my type, but I do have somewhat of a hard time sympathizing.
Yeah, so do I. I agree. I think for me, reading the articles for this episode and generally, I personally had a hard time sympathizing with Thomas Chan just because I could not relate to him. He seemed like...
Yeah.
He wasn't sympathetic of a character, let's just say. But I think there is a lot of questions to be raised in a way where I believe that I am a leftist and I'm a progressive and I am a socialist, an out-and-out socialist. But I also think that society at large, there are still strands of social conservatism amongst people in terms of optics, that things like how a person appears are very important in terms of swaying public opinion. I don't think it should be like that. I think, at least in Canada and in Ontario, people are generally speaking not entirely socially progressive in a sort of radical way. They are in like the general sense, but optics still matter for them. Like going back to this particular case, I don't think anyone would have sympathized with David Sullivan just because of his employment history, his history of drug addiction, his history of criminality. Even though, again, I think there's a lot to be asked about judging him based on all of that. But certainly, I think people in general would sympathize a lot more with Thomas Chan than with David Sullivan.
Well, also, we have to sometimes think of the courtroom itself as a theater, as these people putting on a performance, making a case, and trying to make a jury, usually, or a judge, believe them, believe the story that they're telling.
Yeah, exactly. You're right.
Right, so the optics of who is sitting at the defendant's table do matter. Our internal biases do matter. And we're doing a case next week. It's a pretty well-known one where the perpetrator, the defendant, is a conventionally attractive young woman. And of course that matters. All of this is important to how people are going to see this case. And while we can all agree, we could even argue that maybe juries should not be able to look at defendants. Maybe that person should be hidden behind a curtain. We don't know their name or their age or their race or factors like that. That is definitely an argument we could make. But at the time being, that's how it works. And attorneys, defense attorneys, have to work with that too.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why, defense attorneys will tell their clients to wear their best suit and what have you. And we can argue about the classist implications. And I've never thought about it, but I agree with you that it would be interesting to see if defendants can be obscured from the jury, just to see if that affects sentencing, that affects conviction rates, just by virtue of not knowing the defendant's social identities. I do think that what you said is very, very poignant, because people think of law and legal cases as entirely like narrated by facts and data and experts. But no, it's a spectacle. It's theater. Yes, facts matter. Yes, data matters. Yes, people trust the opinions of experts. But at the end of the day, you need to assemble all of the data, all of the facts, all of your defendant's background, his identity or whatever, into a compelling story. And part of the compelling narrative that you're trying to assemble requires certain presentability and certain optics that I think, whether it's good or bad, is a whole other discussion altogether. But that's something that is, as of now, a strategic concern.
One of the best examples of this, and we'll actually discuss this case later in this episode, and we did a bonus episode on it a while back, is the O.J. Simpson trial. It was theater in that it was literally televised, which was quite new for that time, but also that the defense put on a new narrative where the LAPD, which did have a history of racism, had persecuted this successful Black man. And It worked. It was a show, and it worked.
Oh, absolutely. It was evil of them because I personally believe he did it, but it was successful. And I think it was very smart of them to change the narrative from man kills ex-wife and her boyfriend or the delivery guy or whatever to black man who is successful is being harassed and harangued by the racist LAPD, especially because the LAPD have a history of doing just that.
I don't think it was evil of them, though. Like, I think the defense should put on the best defense that they can. And in this case, they won. They did that. They did their job.
I guess you're right. I guess that's a bit, moral posturing. I think, yeah, you're right. The defense have a right, like the defense should put on the best case they can for the defendant. I think in this case, what really pisses me off is that the prosecution and the investigation personnel dropped the ball so hard.
Right. But I just think if I were charged with a crime, I guess whether I committed it or not, but let's assume I didn't commit it because I've never done something like that, I would want my defense team to be ruthless.
Oh, absolutely. I want them to completely tear apart the prosecution. Now that you mention it, absolutely. Like, I would want Robert Kardashian and the Dream Team defending.
Johnny Cochran, yeah.
Yeah. So, what is happening now? Thomas Chan is currently out on probation, awaiting the outcome of his appeal before the Supreme Court of Canada.
According to a long-form article by Leah McLaren for Maclean's, Chan's probation is very strict, more akin to house arrest. So I'd guess that's why his attorneys are appealing his conviction despite the fact that he has been released from prison. That, and the fact that having a manslaughter conviction on your record can mean lifelong consequences like being shut out from jobs and leases.
Also, I think the other reason is that his legal team have found an opportunity for them to go into legal folklore and to write their names in legal history by being the ones to appeal 33.1.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm not judging them for it. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but having an ego can be a good thing sometimes. And, wanting to immortalize your name, I think, is a very understandable goal or ambition.
Right. This case could set a precedent.
Absolutely. However, because of COVID-19, the case has yet to be scheduled to be heard in front of the Supreme Court. And at the same time, the legal implications of 33.1 versus, drug use, intent, and criminal liability, all of this is pending this appeal, at least here in Canada. And I think this breaks a lot of new ground that is very interesting to think about.
Regarding Thomas Chan specifically, I wonder whether the defense will also argue that his violent actions were a result of documented repeated head injuries during his high school rugby career. A neurodegenerative disease called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, caused by repeated head injuries like those sustained during contact sports, abuse, or repeated headbanging, has been linked to behavioral problems including aggression, depression, mood swings, and suicide. Several pro athletes who were accused or convicted of violent offenses were later discovered to have CTE. Infamously, New England Patriots tight end Aaron Hernandez was serving a life sentence for the murder of Odin Lloyd when he hung himself in his prison cell in 2017. An autopsy showed Hernandez had severe CTE. Kansas City Chiefs linebacker Jovan Belcher killed his girlfriend, Cassandra Perkins, before killing himself in 2012. Doctors later reported signs of CTE in his brain. Former Chicago Bears safety Dave Dwerson killed himself in 2011 and left a note requesting that doctors study his brain. They found that he suffered from CTE. NFL linebacker Junior Seau, who played for 3 different teams over his nearly 20-year career, killed himself in 2012 and was also found to have suffered from CTE. Some people strongly suspect that O.J. Simpson may have suffered from CTE, and that this had a factor in the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, for which O.J. was legally acquitted but remains strongly suspected of committing. WWE wrestler Chris Benoit killed his wife, Nancy, and 7-year-old son, Daniel, before taking his own life in 2007. Doctors found that his brain was severely damaged due to multiple concussions sustained during his pro wrestling career. Other factors like drug abuse and intoxication, as well as problems within the family, may have also been at play. This is a highly requested case for us, the Chris Benoit case, so we might do a separate episode on it in the future. But for now, I think we have to talk about it because it's really interesting with regard for the Thomas Chan situation. Because Benoit had a documented history of steroid and alcohol abuse, and, according to Wikipedia, quote, Xanax and hydrocodone were also found in Chris Benoit's system, at levels the investigators called consistent with therapeutic use. Elevated levels of the synthetic anabolic steroid testosterone cypionate were found in his urine. Investigators believe that the level found suggested it had been taken recently. While the synthetic anabolic steroid testosterone cypionate was found in his urine, there was no evidence of GHB, contrary to speculation. Benoit also tested negative for blood alcohol. End quote. This is particularly relevant to Thomas Chan's case because it begs the question of whether the effects of a brain injury or neurodegenerative disease like CTE can be exacerbated by either long-term drug and alcohol abuse or momentary intoxication. In Benoit's case, some observers suspect that steroid consumption, compounded by CTE, were factors in the murder-suicide. But others point out that Benoit had bound and asphyxiated his wife Nancy, indicating deliberate murder rather than roid rage.
I do want to jump in here and say that we'll definitely do the Chris Benoit case as an episode. I'm very interested in it. I do want to mention that when they studied his brain, the neurosurgery department at West Virginia University stated that, quote, Benoit's brain was so severely damaged, it resembled the brain of an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient, end quote. And to keep in mind, Benoit was 40 when he died. Also, the WWE pumps all of the wrestlers full of steroids, so that's a whole other thing altogether in that case in terms of the liability of the organization and steroid consumption of its workers.
CTE cannot be diagnosed in a living person. It requires an autopsy. So it's impossible to say for certain whether Thomas Chan, or O.J. Simpson for that matter, have the disease and therefore conclude for certain that it might have influenced their behavior. I expect this is why Chan's defense attorneys aren't approaching the case from that angle. It's a different kind of defense which requires more medical speculation than a specific challenge on the constitutionality of Section 33.1. Additionally, if attorneys were to argue CTE as a legal defense, I think it would have to fit under the banner of not guilty by mental disorder, or insanity, as CTE is a medical condition which arguably affects someone's behavior and therefore might be a factor in their execution of a violent crime. Unlike intoxication, which occurs at one particular time due to the person's knowing or unknowing consumption of some other substance, CTE is a permanent brain condition, which can alter a person's personality and behavior. People who suffer from CTE also have a strong argument that the disease itself is not their fault. Nobody wants permanent brain damage, whereas some people deliberately chase the mind alteration they get from drugs or alcohol. The relationship between mental illnesses or disorders, like CTE, and momentary intoxication might be more complicated as a legal defense because there are multiple factors at play. Furthermore, because people cannot be diagnosed with CTE while they're alive, it's possible that some people have the condition and could become violent when triggered by something like drugs or alcohol. Suppose Thomas Chan does suffer from CTE. He still chose to consume psychedelic mushrooms knowing there was a possibility of a bad trip. So he chose to become intoxicated, and the prosecution could argue that the presence or absence of CTE is irrelevant. But suppose someone has a diagnosed mental illness and harms another person while intoxicated. Should that person's defense be able to argue that they are not criminally responsible due to the mental illness, even if the decision to consume drugs or alcohol could have been the factor that put the person over the edge, so to speak? Then there's also the question of what constitutes justice. Is prison the best place for Thomas Chan? Is he likely to reoffend? Is this a violent person who needs to be kept away from society? I'm inclined to think no, but again, there's so many legal factors at play here, and I'm very uncomfortable with taking away the law that prohibits a legal defense of intoxication, when, as we noted earlier, it was put there to protect rape victims.
This episode does ponder a lot of very complicated and conflicting questions. I do think that there's something to be said about the combination of CTE and drugs because magic mushrooms, psilocybin, people intend to take it because they understand or are aware that its effects include hallucinations, audiovisual hallucinations, and altered emotive state. But there's also a sort of belief that the hallucinations will be pleasant and or amusing. When you take it, you don't expect to have a psychotic break. You expect to see talking trees and, laugh with your friends a lot. So the connection between Thomas having CTE and ingesting mushrooms is interesting because can you argue that Thomas took the drugs intending for a particular effect. And because he has CTE, the different effect, the psychotic break, is not deliberate, and therefore he's not criminally liable because the effect was not... when you drink, you're aware you're going to be drunk. When you smoke weed, you're aware you're going to be high. When you take mushrooms, you're aware you're going to trip, but the chances of going on a psychotic break are so minimal to none that you could argue that Thomas's CTE played a big part in this. Of course, we can't diagnose him because you can only diagnose CTE when someone is dead because you need to have an autopsy of their brain. The other thing, with Thomas at least, the CTE defense is interesting because, yeah, he played rugby, and it's definitely noted that he had multiple severe concussions that were so bad that they stopped him from playing rugby anymore. So, you could argue that that's a history there. As to your last point, I do think that there's something to be said about prison being the place for Thomas Chan. I don't think it is. Again, I don't sympathize with him. I've read enough. I could see why others might sympathize with him, but I certainly have no particular affinity for him. That being said, I also don't think he belongs in prison. I've read that he's been keeping to appointments with a psychiatrist 2 times a month, once every 2 weeks, even after the court-mandated period had passed. So he's maintaining his psychiatry appointments even though he doesn't need to by court order anymore, which I think at least shows some semblance of working to heal or to be better or what have you. Is he likely to reoffend? I don't think so. When you have laws with punishments like prison, it's partly to keep people who may cause harm in society away from society, and partly to discourage people from committing crime. For the former, I don't think he's a harm to society in any way, shape, or form. And for the latter, I don't think his intention to commit crime was there in the first place. So in both cases, I think he doesn't belong in jail. But I do agree with you. The problem with this case right now is that the appeal in the Supreme Court is about setting a legal precedent and overturning the constitutionality of 33.1. And I feel extremely uncomfortable and very, very hesitant because I don't want 33.1 to be overturned because it was put in place strictly to defend rape victims from excuses or defenses by perpetrators that they were too drunk and too intoxicated.
And I also think if we are going to look at CTE and hallucinogenic mushrooms combined as the reason for Thomas Chan's mental break, which I believe there's a strong possibility that is exactly what happened, are we going to excuse all harm caused or any harm caused by people who maybe have a history of mental illness or trauma or head injuries and then use drugs or alcohol and hurt or kill other people? And I'm not saying that Thomas Chan has gotten away with it. He hasn't. He's already served time in prison. He has to live his whole life with this horrible thing. And that is so sad. But I don't know, lots of men who abuse women or maybe abuse themselves as children by their parents or by other people that they knew and grew up and take it out on other people and use drugs and alcohol, but it doesn't excuse it.
Yeah, I don't think that. So yeah, you're right. I think at a certain point, and I hate to sound like a conservative here because that's a common conservative trope, but at a certain point, I think people should take responsibility for their own individual actions. And yes, you can recognize the social factors that joined forces to create the person to sort of, shape their perspectives, their psychology, what have you. But again, it goes back to countless people having been abused and not taking it out on other people. So it's not a given. And there's a whole lot of arguments to be made about how we as a society can provide resources for victims of abuse such that they don't reaffirm the circle, they don't repeat the patterns as they grow up and things of that nature. And I also do think that you're still liable for consuming substances. If you do it deliberately, if you consume something deliberately with the hope of getting a particular effect, you're still liable, in my opinion. The same way that someone who drinks and then drives and then runs someone over can't say that they're innocent because they drank too much and they didn't realize how drunk they were. I genuinely think that you're responsible for your intoxicated self because you got yourself to that position. Of course, if you don't intend to get intoxicated and you get an alcoholic drink that you don't know you're unaware is alcoholic or what have you, that's a whole other thing altogether. But again, the flip side of all of this is, does Thomas Chan belong in prison? And I think that's a no. But given that they're doing this by appealing 33.1, I have very mixed feelings about wanting the appeal to succeed. because I think 33.1 is a very important part of the Canadian Criminal Code.
I agree that when it comes down to legal philosophy as well, and just our politics in general, we should be about minimizing harm. So for instance, when it comes to drug use, I think Narcan should be freely available and lots of people should carry and know how to use it in case someone has an overdose. Now, whether that person took that drug trying to overdose, that drug has to be opioids, by the way, trying to overdose, or if they took heroin that was laced with fentanyl and they didn't realize that, it doesn't matter. We should do everything that we can to help someone who is about to die from this, even if they took that drug knowingly. And I think it's despicable that there are people out there, namely conservatives, who will say things like, oh, well, I can't get my medicine, but there's Narcan for free at my blah, blah, blah. Like, okay, it is bad that you can't get your medicine, but that's not the fault of someone whose life was saved by Narcan.
Yeah, your anger should be directed towards pharmaceutical companies and for-profit medication and patents and all of that, not the Narcan that's saving the life of someone who really, like, they're not responsible for the fact that your medication costs money.
Right. And I actually do think some of the left discourse around drug use can be kind of bad. As someone who has seen family members destroyed by drug use and seen lives destroyed and seen people suffer because the people that they loved have become addicted to these substances, I think it's a little upsetting when people have this very disconnected philosophy of like, oh, well, it's your body. It doesn't harm anyone. It does harm other people. I'm sorry to tell you, but it does.
Oh, yeah, it's a social problem, not a personal problem. It's something that affects other people, the people around the addict as well. And I think the left needs to recognize that addiction and excessive drug use is something that affects a collective, not just the individual doing it.
Right, but I always think our focus should be minimizing harm, and that means creating safe places for people to use drugs who are going to use drugs, making sure that those drugs are safe for them to take, as in not laced with other substances and that they have clean needles, and always making sure that help is available for them.
Yeah, I completely agree. Let us know how you feel about this Thomas Chan case and where you stand on this legal debate. Let us know on Instagram at Das Criminal Pod, that is DAS Criminal Pod. We also have a Patreon where we do bonus episodes, and if you sign up, you get access to the entire archive of past bonus episodes at patreon.com/Das Criminal, that is DAS Criminal. And, rate, review us, subscribe, tell your friends, let us know. The reviews are very important because they help us be more visible thanks to the almighty algorithm.
Yeah, and hopefully you all can tell, but we do put a lot of time and research into the podcast. So we hope that you enjoy it, that it gives you a little boost in your week.
Yeah, so until next time, bye. Everyone.